Hey everyone, I'm Ellie, and welcome to today's webinar on navigating China-US tariffs. This is a subject that affects more and more people, and the demand for a webinar like this has been extremely strong. That's especially evidenced by the number of you who signed up and joined this webinar. We've got a great crowd and an even better, an equally great presenter. Today we want to answer 3 basic questions. How did we get here? What products are affected? And are there workarounds? But first, here's a quick refresher or intro for those of you unfamiliar with Freightos. Freightos is the world's largest freight marketplace, helping thousands of importers, like you, book and manage freight across over 75 providers. The key difference with Freightos is that we help you navigate pricing with real visibility into the current market. And we also help you manage all your shipments and billing in one platform. And we top that off with some great technology and human support. If you haven't already, you can sign up for a free account at freightos.com. I'll wait. No, I won't. So before we get started, I want to take a quick look at freight prices over the past couple of months. Since late September and until the start of Chinese New Year in March, rates have been fairly high. Flagging global trade and tariffs have changed that. Rates are now close to where they were last year, which turned out to be a pretty poor year for ocean carriers. Seasonality is the most dependable factor for freight prices. Ocean carriers typically try to introduce higher prices early, with false price increases at the beginning of July before a stronger showing in August and September. On the air freight side, carrier capacity has been really weak, with under 50% of space utilized, which means that rates will likely stay fairly weak. That said, a lot can still happen. Carriers increased prices this month by cutting down on active ships, but that likely won't last. Other events, like a natural disaster or a carrier going bankrupt, such as Hanjin in 2016, could still suddenly send prices soaring. One more interesting thing to keep an eye out for is tariffs. If a new list is introduced with enough warning for buyers to beat the deadline, ocean prices will likely spike earlier. However, if it's anything like the last tariff, the only way to beat them will be by air. But speaking of customs, I'd like to introduce Chris Reynolds, CEO and co-founder of INLT, a digital customs brokerage, freight partner, and someone who really gets customs. We'll be taking questions at the end, so please send them through Zoom. And if you haven't done this before, just click on the questions box in Zoom and submit your question. So without further ado, Chris Reynolds.
All right. Thank you, Ellie. And thank you for inviting us to participate on the call. As mentioned, I'm a licensed broker. I've been a broker for about 14 years. I began my career with a large 3PL where it became evident that customs brokerage was at the risk of becoming that bottleneck in a rapidly evolving supply chain that was becoming increasingly digital. We're the first provider with a fully cloud-based infrastructure and an API with the goal of making data availability and connectivity available to all of our partners. So I thought a good spot to get started would be a brief history of Section 301 duties, often called Trump tariffs. So we're approaching, obviously, a 1-year anniversary, and certainly not one that too many people would celebrate. So back on July 6th of 2018, List 1 was published, and it was comparatively a small list, covering $34 billion worth of goods being imported from China, and it assessed a 25% duty rate on those products. Shortly thereafter, on August 23rd, sort of a bolt-on to that List 1 that encompassed $16 billion worth of goods from China was also assessed 25% duty, and that's often referred to as List 2. Finally, List 3 was published on September 24th, and it covered $200 billion worth of products from China. So certainly the most all-encompassing list of the three. And as far as we're concerned, there are 3 active lists. So you might hear people refer to lists 4 or 5, and I'll talk about what that means exactly in just a couple minutes. But these are the 3 active lists. And that 10% on list 3 just jumped to 25% on May 10th. And the one wrinkle in that leap was that it was goods that were exported on May 10th or later, whereas the previous lists were based on import dates. So what Ellie had referred to earlier regarding the speed with which you can get goods on the water may in fact be relevant depending on how a potential list 4 is implemented. So right now we have 3 lists. When that duty increase from 10 to 25% occurred, a new list wasn't published. It was the same products that originally appeared on list 3. It just increased the duty from 10 to 25%. All right, slide. So I think what everybody's concerned with is what's the future and what is this list for? And there is indeed a prospective list 4 that was published by the U.S. Trade Representative on May 17th, so nearly a month ago. And it invited comments from the public on how that list would impact your business. So how would it affect hiring and firing decisions, margins, product or price increases, things of that nature. Those comments are due by June 17th. There are 3 things or 4 things that they're looking for when considering whether an exclusion might be relevant, and we'll talk about them in just a minute too. But one thing I wanted to highlight is that there is indeed bipartisan support for action against China. So maybe not in the way of these tariffs, but I want to say this because I think that there's a sentiment in the trade that these tariffs go away with the next election cycle or with Trump's impeachment. That's not entirely clear, and no candidate is comfortable taking a position that might be portrayed as offshoring jobs. So while I think they enjoy or maybe recognize the fact that the mechanics of the tariffs have been harsh and disruptive to business, they enjoy that Trump has borne the sort of the assault or the negative coverage in the mainstream media. Okay. So everybody wants to know certainly what products are affected, and there are 6,864 8-digit HTS subheadings covered by lists 1, 2, and 3. In fact, it's probably easier to talk about what's not affected than what is affected. So chemicals, pharmaceuticals, footwear, and apparel are among the products most widely exempt from the current lists, so lists 1, 2, and 3. So what happens if list 4 goes into effect? Only 453 8-digit HTS subheadings would not be covered. So that's about 4% of the 11,000 8-digit subheadings in the tariff schedule. And while chemicals and pharmaceuticals and other medical devices commonly found in chapters 28, 29, 30, and chapter 90 will remain exempt according to the list that was published back on May 17th, the biggest impact will be felt among footwear and apparel importers who already incur some of the highest duty rates in the tariff schedule and are no longer exempt from this additional, we're calling it 25%, but even the rate's not entirely clear. So just like list 3, where it was originally proposed to 25%, they did reduce it back to 10% before implementation. So we might expect that the possibility of something like that could occur again. All right, slide. And then how to tell if your product is subject to the duties. So apart from just asking your customs broker, and we have a sort of a quick lookup tool on our website, if you're brave enough to venture into the tariff schedule, and if you pull the hard copy or the PDF copy off of the International Trade Commission website, you'll see something that looks like this, where you've got your tariff number and a description, followed by the duty rate in a column to the right. And affixed to that duty rate, in this case, the one you see here is free. You see a small footnote, so 2 followed by a /. That footnote refers to a tariff number in Chapter 99, usually something like 990388, followed by 01, 02, or 03. That's indicative of a product that's subject to these tariffs. And the 1, 2, and 3 represent the list that it's on. While that had a major impact in the past because there was 25% duty rates and 10% duty rates, now that they're all 25%, it's largely irrelevant. The bottom image that you saw there was just the digital version of that same tariff schedule. So the ITC also publishes one. It's sort of an easy lookup on their site, and it looks exactly the same, except it often omits the little number 2 alongside the footnote, so perhaps even harder to see, but a small / there that's a hyperlink, and it'll bring you to that same tariff number. So keep your eye out for those. All right. So there are indeed exclusions, although it's a very narrow group of products that are excluded. Moreover, the only exclusions that have been granted to date appear on list 1. So they've only ruled on list 1. There have been 985 total requests that were granted an exemption. 4,500 others have been denied. We're told that there are about 3,300 that are tentatively approved, but are pending basically guidance on CBP administration. And you'll see that that's one of the criteria in applying for an exclusion, is that you've got to give the administration some guidance on how you expect U.S. Customs to administer the exclusion. And what I mean is that people are petitioning for an exclusion that sort of defies the tariff schedule. So something that's more narrow than one of the 11,000 subheadings. And an example would be like a blender that's used in commercial applications. Well, there is no tariff for a blender used in commercial applications. There's just a blender. And it'd be very difficult for Customs to administer that exclusion without introducing a high degree of subjectivity for Customs when they're examining the cargo and determining whether this is or is not designed or intended for use in commercial applications. So you've got to give them guidance on what the features, so maybe the output, the wattage, the power, the size, how you expect them to define this exclusion and enforce it on Customs level. So like I mentioned, all the exclusions are currently granted for list 1. They're considering exclusions for list 2. And there's currently no way to request an exclusion on list 3. So if you've been incurring that 10% duty, which just jumped to 25%, unfortunately, there's no way to even ask for an exclusion right now, although we expect them to publish that very soon. The administration's position had been, as long as it was 10%, it really wasn't harmful enough to justify developing an exclusion process. And Congress has since mandated that they change their position and release some guidance on that. Exclusions apply to everybody, and we continue publishing a running list of these exclusions on our website. But if you're a small importer and simply didn't have the means or understanding to go about applying for an exclusion, but one of your enterprise level peers, a Whirlpool or Johnson & Johnson or Apple or somebody had gone out and gotten an exclusion that applies to your product as well, you're welcome to take advantage of that. Those exclusions are also retroactive to the date of original implementation. So since we're talking about list 1 only, you can recover Section 301 duties that were paid all the way back to July 6th of last year. As I mentioned, there's nothing available for list 3 yet. And just, a quick scan of everything that had been excluded thus far, you'll find that It sort of fits this theme of Chapter 84 and 85, and I really can't wrap my head around why, but it's predominantly turbines, rotors, pumps, impellers, heat exchangers, these things that are both electric and mechanical appliances. All right, and I'll share that list that's in our help center with the Freightos team to share with you guys as well. So if you do want to pursue an exclusion, unfortunately the window for lists 1 and 2 is closed, but we expect the one for list 3 to be opening any day now. This is what you have to prove. The 3 chief criteria are: is the product available from a source outside of China? Would additional duties cause severe economic harm to the requester or other U.S. interests? And is the product strategically important or related to Chinese industrial programs such as Made in China 2025? A lot of subjectivity is baked into those 3 questions. For example, some attorneys that we consult and follow have mentioned that they've had denials based on the first criteria, available from a source outside of China. Well, some of the product is available outside of China, but the output is less than 5% of what they might have been able to get in China. They also commented that that 5% is almost entirely part of a vertically integrated supply chain. So somebody like General Motors or Ford might have set up a plant to manufacture brake pads in another country, Vietnam, for example. But they're certainly not going to sell it to a small aftermarket supplier of brake pads. It just so happens that they've built their supply chain around manufacturing in other countries. So it's not necessarily viable, but the trade representative has used those grounds for denial. Would additional duties cause severe economic harm? Certainly 25% duty assessed on a product, if it can't be passed along to a distributor or consumer, could nearly put businesses out of business or into bankruptcy. So, you'd have to come up with a way to articulate or explain that. And then certainly trying to harm Chinese industrial programs like Made in China 2025. There's a lot of material about that program out there on the web. So if the product you're petitioning is on that list, it's unlikely that you'll get a denial. A brief look at the timeline is just that you generally have 90 days to file a request for an exclusion. So that's why lists 1 and 2 are no longer available. When list 3 comes out, there will be a deadline roughly 90 days thereafter. After you submit, or after the 90-day window is closed, the public will have 14 days to file responses. So that might mean the domestic industry saying that, certainly a domestic manufacturer saying we support this 25% and what this importer is saying is wrong. Those tend to be the responses that get submitted. And then you, in turn, have 7 days to reply to their response explaining why they're wrong. So whether any of this has real meaning or merit is, not entirely clear. But if like I said, there's been certainly far more denials than exemptions granted. But if those 3,300 tentatively approved exclusions, they're kind of sitting in a sort of a purgatory waiting for customs to determine whether it can be administered. If they get approved, it's about a 45% success rate. So, I can't comment on whether they will be approved, but that's not so bad. So we'll keep an eye on the exclusions that continue to roll out, and then we'll provide some guidance on list 3 when we get it from this trade representative. All right. So here are some options, really just some things that you might want to consider. It's not necessarily things that you can do, but one of the subjects that was debated when these were first introduced back in July of last year was whether the Section 301 duties would be recoverable via the drawback program. So specifically goods that are re-exported or don't satisfy some quality standards and they're destroyed, you can file drawback for those and get 99% of your duties back. When you do that, you'll get the Section 301 duties back as well. So one thing to consider if your supply chain includes re-exporting goods out of the U.S. back to other countries or to Canada. And then also keep an eye on this miscellaneous tariff bill, which has been around for a very long time. It was signed into law most recently, the existing iteration, in September of 2018. And it offers these duty suspensions and reductions based on whether the product was available or manufactured domestically. So there are 1,600 products or tariff numbers covered by this miscellaneous tariff bill, but unfortunately it doesn't exempt the product from the Section 301 duties. So you will get relief from the normal duty rate, so somewhere between 3% and 32%, depending on what the product is. But you'll still pay, unfortunately, the 25% of Section 301 duties. So if you want to learn more about that, we're happy to provide some guidance. But those products exist also in Chapter 99, the same place that the Section 301 tariffs are provided for. All right. And without getting overly technical on any of these subjects, I wanted to stop there and kind of just open the floor to questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris. That was
my pleasure.
Really, really great stuff. We have a couple questions here already. So with new 25% tariffs, what is current cutoff dates for items on the water not having to pay increased tariffs?
So as long as the item was on the water by May 10th, it's eligible for entry at 10% if it gets here by June 15th. So there's been a lot of confusion around the dates because the original order by the trade representative said export by May 10th, import by June 1st. And I think what they realized is that transit times are often much longer than that. And therefore they extended it to June 15th. So on the water by May 10th is the first criteria. If it's after May 10th, you're out of luck. But if it's on the water before May 10th, it has to get here by June 15th. So just another, 3 days.
Okay. How do tariffs on imports from China competitors like Vietnam compare?
So there's a normal duty rate that's assessed to all countries, all World Trade Organization countries, Vietnam, one of them, and historically they would have been subject to the same duty rate, but with the imposition of these Section 301 duties, it's effectively 25% less if the product is on any of the three lists. So you can source from a country like Vietnam and pay the normal duty rate. So in many cases, 25% less than what it would be from China. And frankly, that's the administration's objective here. Is a lot of these products are not available, obviously, in the U.S. They're not manufactured in the U.S. And they recognize that. And I think that one of their strategies here is to weaken China. So force importers to source from other countries, understanding that other country is not going to be the U.S. and it's not just going to instantly stand up an industry or manufacturing industry in the United States. So that's sort of the objective.
Okay. There's someone here who imports Chinese herbs that only grow in China, and he's getting slapped with the tariff. But should he be, since these are raw materials that only come from this one country?
Well, if it's covered by a list and that those lists were put together very quickly and perhaps haphazardly, I don't know how they went about constructing them. It sounds like you have an argument for requesting an exclusion if one wasn't already requested. So I mean, you at least satisfy that first criteria, but unfortunately, the burden of proof is sort of on you. So you've got to prove that those herbs are not available in other countries. And there's some resources from which you could derive that information. The Census Bureau, for example, has a pretty robust reporting tool that you can search on tariff numbers and see from which countries those tariffs were imported from in the previous 12 months. And I'm quite sure that that's exactly what the trade representative will do as well.
Okay, we're gonna do one more. On December 18th, 2018, the USTR granted exceptions to the July 6th increases for certain HTS codes. We're wondering if you think they will remain exempt from future changes.
Yes. So far, and like I said, the future, like the list 4, for example, is a bit unclear. But they've said in that proposed rulemaking that the existing exclusions will remain in effect if list 4 were to become effective. So assuming they move forward with list 4, any existing exclusions will apply or remain in effect.
Okay, great. So thank you so much. And I want to thank everyone for joining, and a huge thanks to Chris for sharing his expertise with us and really simplifying what I think is a pretty complicated topic. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. I hope it was of value to you, and feel free to shoot any questions over to us after the call. I'm happy to answer them.
All right, thanks so much.
All right, thank you.
Bye, everybody.